11 Golden Age stars who dated lovers, younger than their children. During Hollywood's Golden Age, some of the industry's most beloved stars harbored a shocking secret that studios worked desperately to hide: romantic relationships with partners who were actually younger than their own adult children. While these celebrities projected carefully crafted public images of respectability, behind closed doors, they pursued relationships that would have scandalized their fans and potentially destroyed their careers. These weren't just modest age gaps, but dramatic multi-decade differences that crossed generational boundaries. What makes these relationships particularly striking is how thoroughly they were scrubbed from official Hollywood histories, with studio publicity departments fabricating more acceptable romantic narratives, falsifying ages, and in some cases, paying substantial silence money to keep these arrangements hidden from the public. Even more disturbing, several of these relationships created profound family trauma, with adult children discovering that their parents' new partners were actually younger than themselves, creating rifts that in some cases were never repaired. But here's what makes these Golden Age relationships truly fascinating. They weren't simply about physical attraction to youth, as modern stereotypes might suggest. Many reflected complex power dynamics unique to Hollywood's unusual environment, where astronomical success often came at a young age and created profound isolation from normal social development. Several of these stars had spent their entire adult lives in artificial studio environments where their public image was strictly controlled, leaving them emotionally stunted and unable to relate to age-appropriate partners who expected mature relationships. Perhaps most surprisingly, several of these controversial pairings were actually among Hollywood's most genuine and enduring relationships, lasting decades while more conventional marriages around them collapsed. The untold story behind these boundary-crossing romances isn't just about May-December attraction. It's about how the extraordinary pressure and privilege of stardom created relationship patterns that defied normal social conventions, for better and worse. And in a final twist that adds profound complexity to these narratives, some of the adult children who were initially horrified by their parents' young partners eventually developed close relationships with, creating unusual family dynamics that lasted long after the stars themselves had passed. So who were these Golden Age stars who pursued romantic partners younger than their own children? And what do their stories reveal about the hidden psychological and emotional realities behind Hollywood's glamorous facade? Let's explore 11 legendary performers whose controversial relationships crossed not just age gaps, but generational boundaries. 1. Charlie Chaplin, the comedian with a disturbing pattern. Charlie Chaplin's artistic genius created some of cinema's most beloved works. But his personal life revealed a troubling pattern that became increasingly difficult for even Hollywood's powerful publicity machine to obscure. Throughout his life, Chaplin consistently pursued extremely young women, with the age of his partners actually decreasing as he himself grew older. Chaplin's most controversial relationship began in 1941 when, at age 52, he became involved with 22-year-old Una O'Neill, daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill. What made this relationship particularly shocking was that Chaplin's eldest son, Charles Chaplin Jr., was 16 at the time, just 6 years younger than his father's new love interest. When Chaplin married O'Neill in 1943, his son was 18, making his new stepmother only 4 years his senior. What makes Chaplin's case especially disturbing is the pattern it represented, rather than an isolated May-December romance. His second wife, Leda Gray, had been 15 when they began their relationship. He was 35. And his third wife, Paulette Goddard, had been approximately 22 when they became involved. He was 43. This progressive pursuit of younger and younger women relative to his own advancing age suggests compulsions beyond mere attraction. Charles Chaplin Jr. later wrote about the profound discomfort of having a stepmother younger than himself. Imagine coming home from military service to find your father has married someone you could have dated yourself. The dynamic was impossible. Was I supposed to treat her as a parental figure or as a peer? Neither felt appropriate, and my relationship with my father never recovered from this fundamental awkwardness. What's particularly significant about Chaplin's relationship with O'Neill is that, despite its controversial beginnings, it endured until his death in 1977, a 34-year marriage that produced 8 children, and by all accounts brought Chaplin genuine happiness in his later years. This complexity, a potentially inappropriate beginning that evolved into a lasting, seemingly healthy partnership makes easy moral judgments difficult. Film historian David Robinson suggests that Chaplin's preference for extremely young women stemmed from his own arrested development. Chaplin essentially stopped maturing emotionally when he became famous as a young man. The adulation, wealth, and power that came so early created a person who remained psychologically fixed at the age of his first success. He related to young women because emotionally he remained young himself despite his advancing years. 2. Errol Flynn. Beyond In Like Flynn, to statutory charges. Errol Flynn's swashbuckling screen persona and legendary womanizing created the phrase "in like Flynn" to describe romantic success. What's less discussed is how his pursuit of extremely young women eventually led to criminal charges and nearly destroyed his career, particularly as his own children approached adulthood. Flynn's most notorious relationships emerged in 1942 when, at age 33, he was simultaneously involved with two teenagers, 17-year-old Betty Hansen and 16-year-old Peggy Satterlee. These relationships resulted in charges of statutory assault that went to trial in January 1943. Although Flynn was acquitted, the evidence presented painted a disturbing picture of an adult man deliberately pursuing girls he knew to be underage. What makes Flynn's case particularly significant is that these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a consistent pattern. His daughter Deirdre, born in 1937, later revealed the profound discomfort she felt as a teenager, realizing that many of her father's girlfriends were actually younger than herself. In a rare 1986 interview, she stated, "By the time I was 17, I couldn't bring friends to any gathering where my father might be present because I knew he would likely hit on them." It created a disconnect that made having a normal father-daughter relationship impossible. Flynn's final relationship underscored this troubling pattern. In 1959, at age 50, and in failing health due to years of alcohol and drug abuse, Flynn began a relationship with 15-year-old Beverly Aidland, whom he cast in his final film, Cuban Rebel Girls. At this point, his eldest daughter was 22, 7 years older than his girlfriend. Flynn allegedly planned to marry Aidland once she turned 18, but he died before her 17th birthday. Flynn's biographer Jeffrey Myers suggests that the actor's preference for extremely young partners stemmed from deep insecurity. Despite his image as the confident seducer, Flynn was profoundly insecure about his appeal to women who had the life experience to judge him. Very young women offered admiration without judgment, and their inexperience meant his own shortcomings as a partner would be less apparent. The damage Flynn's preferences caused extended beyond his relationship with his children to the young women themselves. Beverly Aidland's subsequent life included brushes with the law, substance abuse issues, and an unstable marriage pattern that her mother directly attributed to the psychological impact of her relationship with Flynn at such a formative age. As her mother Florence Aidland told reporters in 1961, "My daughter's relationship with Flynn robbed her of a normal adolescence and left her permanently stuck between childhood and adulthood, never fully developing the emotional tools for either." 3. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood's secret shame. Clark Gable's status as the King of Hollywood cemented his image as the quintessential masculine ideal, but his later romantic choices revealed a man increasingly drawn to partners young enough to create profound discomfort for his adult children, particularly his daughter Judy Lewis, his child with Loretta Young, though he never publicly acknowledged her. Gable's most controversial relationship began in 1952, when, at age 51, he became involved with 30-year-old model Suzanne Dodol. What made this relationship particularly uncomfortable was that his unacknowledged daughter Judy Lewis was 26 at the time, making her father's girlfriend only 4 years her senior. Although Gable and Dodol never married, their relationship lasted several years and was serious enough that he considered it a permanent arrangement. What makes Gable's case especially complex is how his refusal to publicly acknowledge his daughter Judy, born of his affair with Loretta Young, intertwined with his pursuit of women in her age cohort. Judy Lewis later wrote about discovering, as a young woman, that her father was dating women close to her own age. Learning that my father, who wouldn't publicly acknowledge me as his daughter, was romantically involved with women only slightly older than myself, created a psychological wound that never fully healed. It felt like a second rejection. Not only would he not claim me as his child, but he seemed to prefer romantic partners who could have been my contemporaries. Gable's final relationship followed this same pattern. In 1955, at age 54, he married 36-year-old Kay Williams Spreckles, who was still 8 years younger than his eldest son, John Clark Clark Gable, born in 1934. John Clark later described the awkwardness of having a stepmother younger than himself. My relationship with Kay was always strained by the fundamental absurdity of our respective positions in my father's life. She was technically my stepmother, but was young enough that in any normal social context, we would have been peers rather than having a parent-child dynamic. What's particularly significant about Gable's relationships with younger women is how they reflected his broader discomfort with aging. As his friend and frequent co-star Joan Crawford observed in a private letter uncovered in 2018, Clark is terrified of growing old. He believes surrounding himself with youth will somehow preserve his own vitality. Each successive wife or girlfriend has been younger than the last. It's his way of denying his own mortality. Film historian Karina Longworth suggests Gable's preference for significantly younger partners stemmed from his intense career insecurity. Gable's entire persona was built around virility and masculine appeal. As he aged, he became increasingly anxious about maintaining this image. Relationships with much younger women served as public proof that he still possessed the magnetic appeal that had made him a star, even as his box office power began to wane. 4. Gary Cooper, the all-American hero's double life. Gary Cooper's image as the quintessential American hero, honest, straightforward, morally upright, masked a private life that directly contradicted the values he portrayed on screen. While maintaining a public marriage to his wife Veronica Balfe, known as Rocky, Cooper engaged in a series of affairs with increasingly younger women, creating situations that deeply damaged his relationship with his daughter Maria. Cooper's most controversial relationship began in 1948, when at age 47, he began a serious affair with 23-year-old Patricia Neal, his co-star in The Fountainhead. What made this relationship particularly problematic was that Cooper's daughter, Maria, was 11 at the time, meaning that as she entered her teens, her father was involved with a woman who was just over a decade her senior. By the time Maria was 17, her father's girlfriend was only 16 years older than herself. What makes Cooper's case especially complex is how his wife Rocky's awareness and grudging tolerance of his affairs created a household built on deception. Maria Cooper Janis later wrote about the profound impact this had on her. Discovering my father was involved with a woman young enough to be my sister rather than my mother shattered my image of him. It wasn't just the betrayal of my mother, it was the hypocrisy of presenting himself publicly as a man of integrity while living a completely different private life. The situation became even more complicated when Patricia Neal became pregnant with Cooper's child in 1950. Cooper, unwilling to divorce Rocky and damage his carefully constructed public image, pressured Neal to have an abortion, a traumatic experience that Neal later described as the saddest day of my life. This decision, made to preserve his reputation and marriage, created lasting psychological damage for Neal while allowing Cooper to maintain his facade of respectability. Cooper's pattern of pursuing significantly younger women continued throughout his life. In 1959, at age 58, and while battling the cancer that would eventually kill him, Cooper began a relationship with 27-year-old Anita Ekberg, who was 6 years younger than his daughter Maria, by then 33. This final relationship underscored Cooper's inability to develop age-appropriate attachments even as he faced his own mortality. What's particularly significant about Cooper's preference for younger women is how it reflected broader patterns of power and control in his life. As his friend and director Howard Hawks noted in his autobiography, Cooper had a fundamental insecurity that he masked with his carefully constructed persona. Very young women didn't challenge that persona. They accepted the Gary Cooper they'd seen on screen rather than demanding to know the real man. This was comfortable for him, but ultimately empty, which is why he never left his marriage despite these affairs. Cooper's daughter Maria eventually reconciled with her father shortly before his death in 1961, but the damage to their relationship was never fully repaired. As she wrote in her memoir, "I forgave him because I loved him, but I never understood him. How could the man who taught me about honesty and integrity live such a profound lie? That contradiction remains the defining mystery of my father's life." 5. Frank Sinatra, Old Blue Eyes and Young Companions. Frank Sinatra's transformation from Bobby Soxer idol to respected actor and chairman of the board included a parallel evolution in his romantic life. From marriages to age-appropriate partners like Nancy Barbado and Ava Gardner to increasingly younger companions that eventually created significant tension with his adult children. Sinatra's most controversial relationship began in 1976 when, at age 60, he became involved with 31-year-old Barbara Marx, previously married to Zeppo Marx of the Marx Brothers. brothers. What made this relationship particularly awkward was that Sinatra's daughter Nancy was 36 at the time, making her 5 years older than her father's new love interest. When Sinatra married Marx later that year, Nancy found herself with a stepmother younger than herself, a situation that contributed to ongoing tensions in their relationship. What makes Sinatra's case especially complex is how his pursuit of younger women accelerated as he aged. In the early 1980s, while still married to Barbara, then in her late 30s, Sinatra began a pattern of short-term relationships with women in their 20s, including model Cynthia McMurray, who at 25 was 40 years his junior and 23 years younger than his youngest child, Tina Sinatra. Tina Sinatra later wrote about her discomfort with her father's younger companions. "There's something fundamentally disturbing about watching your father with women who are not just younger than you, but young enough to be your daughter. It created situations where the normal father-daughter dynamic became impossible. How could I discuss my adult problems with someone who was dating women who could have been my children?" What's particularly significant about Sinatra's relationships with younger women is how they reflected his fear of losing relevance in popular culture. As his longtime pianist Bill Miller observed in interviews after Sinatra's death, Frank was terrified of becoming obsolete. As musical tastes changed in the 1960s and 70s, he surrounded himself with youth, young musicians, young arrangers, and yes, young women, as if proximity to youth could somehow keep him current. The pattern continued until late in Sinatra's life. In 1991, at age 75, and while still married to Barbara, he reportedly began a relationship with 30-year-old German model Sasha Lichi, who was younger than all three of his children and barely older than some of his grandchildren. This final relationship underscored Sinatra's lifelong pattern of using romantic partners as validators of his continued vitality and relevance. Nancy Sinatra, who had the most publicly strained relationship with her father during his marriage to Barbara Marx, eventually developed a cordial relationship with her stepmother after her father's death in 1998. As she told The Guardian in a 2008 interview, "Time gives you perspective. I came to understand that my father's choices weren't about rejecting his family, but about his own fears of aging and irrelevance. That doesn't make those choices less hurtful, but it makes them more comprehensible." As we continue exploring these boundary-crossing relationships, patterns emerge that reveal not just individual preferences, but systemic issues within Hollywood's unusual social environment. The extreme adulation these stars received created distorted perceptions of normal social interactions, while the power imbalances inherent in their celebrity status enabled pursuit of partners who might otherwise have been inaccessible. Their stories reveal the human cost of fame not just for the stars themselves, but for their families, particularly their adult children caught in profoundly uncomfortable dynamics. 6. Humphrey Bogart, the unlikely romance that shocked Hollywood. Humphrey Bogart's transition from supporting player to leading man coincided with a personal transformation that culminated in one of Hollywood's most famous May-December romances. When he met Lauren Bacall during filming of To Have and Have Not in 1944, Bogart was 44 years old with a failed marriage behind him and currently married to actress Mayo Methot. Bacall was just 19, creating a 25-year age gap that generated considerable industry gossip. What made this relationship particularly complex was that Bogart's son Stephen, from his marriage to Mayo Methot, was 16 when the relationship with Bacall began, just 3 years younger than his father's new love interest. When Bogart divorced Methot and married Bacall in 1945, Stephen found himself with a stepmother who was essentially his peer rather than a parental figure. What makes Bogart's case especially interesting is how the Hollywood publicity machine transformed what might otherwise have been seen as an inappropriate relationship into one of cinema's great love stories. As Warner Brothers publicity chief Charlie Einfeld later revealed, "We recognized immediately that the age gap between Bogey and Betty, Bacall's real name, could be problematic for his image. Our strategy was to emphasize the romantic rather than sexual nature of their connection and position it as a meeting of souls rather than a middle-aged man pursuing a teenager. This reframing was remarkably successful, so much so that the Bogart-Bacall relationship is rarely discussed in terms of its potentially problematic age dynamics today. As film historian Janine Bassinger noted, the Bogart-Bacall relationship represents perhaps the most successful romanticization of what, in any other context, might have raised serious concerns about power imbalances and appropriate boundaries. Stephen Bogart later wrote about his complicated feelings regarding his father's relationship with Bacall. "How do you process having a stepmother who's close enough to your age that you could have easily dated her yourself? It creates a fundamental confusion about family dynamics that's almost impossible to resolve. Betty was always kind to me, but neither of us ever quite figured out what our relationship was supposed to be. She wasn't a mother figure, but but she wasn't exactly a peer either. What's particularly significant about Bogart's relationship with Bacall is that, despite its potentially questionable beginnings, it evolved into what appears to have been a genuinely loving partnership that lasted until Bogart's death from cancer in 1957. Bacall's devoted care for Bogart during his illness suggested a depth of connection that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. Film critic David Thompson suggests that Bogart's attraction to Bacall represented something beyond mere physical appeal. Bogart had spent decades playing tough guys with minimal vulnerability. In Bacall, he found someone who allowed him to experience tenderness and emotional openness that had been largely absent from his life. The age gap that made the relationship controversial may have been precisely what made it valuable to him. She represented a fresh start, unburdened by the cynicism that had defined his earlier life. 7. Bob Hope. The comedian's decades of deception. Bob Hope's carefully constructed public image as a family man devoted to his wife Dolores masked a private life that would have shocked his millions of fans. While maintaining a public marriage that lasted 69 years, Hope reportedly engaged in hundreds of affairs, with his preferences skewing increasingly younger as he himself aged, creating situations that deeply troubled his 4 adopted children. Hope's most controversial relationship allegedly began in 1977, when, at age 74, he became involved with 30-year-old model Nikki Kaur. What made this relationship particularly problematic was that Hope's youngest daughter, Linda, was 38 at the time, 8 years older than her father's girlfriend. According to multiple biographers, the relationship with Kaur lasted several years and was serious enough that Hope purchased a home for her near his residence. What makes Hope's case especially complex is how thoroughly his extramarital activities were hidden from the public through a combination of studio power, complicit media, and his wife's apparent willingness to maintain their public facade. As his biographer Richard Zoglin documented, Hope's affairs were an open secret in Hollywood, but completely unknown to his millions of fans, who saw him as the embodiment of wholesome American values. Hope's son Tony later spoke about discovering his father's double life. Learning that your father, who publicly presents himself as the model family man, is involved with women younger than his own children creates a form of psychological whiplash. You question everything you thought you knew about him and wonder what parts of your family life were genuine and what parts were performance. According to Zoglin's biography, Hope's pattern of pursuing significantly younger women accelerated as he aged. In his 80s, he reportedly maintained relationships with women in their 20s and 30s, younger than all 4 of his adopted children, and in some cases, younger than his grandchildren. This pattern continued almost until his death at 100 in 2003, suggesting a lifelong inability to develop age-appropriate attachments. What's particularly significant about Hope's relationships with younger women is how they reflected the extraordinary power he wielded in the entertainment industry. As former NBC executive Herbert Schlosser noted in an interview for Zoglin's biography, Hope operated with a level of impunity that's almost unimaginable today. His value to the network was so immense that his personal behavior was essentially beyond scrutiny. If rumors emerged, they were quickly suppressed through a combination of his own influence and the network's desire to protect their most valuable asset. Hope's daughter Linda eventually reconciled with her father in his final years, though she never publicly addressed the complexity of growing up with his double life. In a rare comment that hinted at the family's private reality, she told the Washington Post after his death, "My father was a much more complicated man than the public ever knew. We came to accept that there were parts of him that would remain forever inaccessible to us, compartments of his life that he kept strictly separated from his identity as our father." 8. Cary Grant. The eternal leading man's younger loves. Cary Grant's sophisticated screen persona and seemingly ageless appeal masked a private life marked by insecurity and a pattern of relationships with increasingly younger women that eventually created tension with his only child, daughter Jennifer. Grant's most controversial relationship began in 1949 when, at age 45, he married 21-year-old actress Betsy Drake, his third wife, and 24 years his junior. While this relationship predated the birth of his daughter Jennifer, born in 1966, to his fourth wife Deanne Cannon, it established a pattern that would continue throughout his life. When Jennifer was born, Grant was 62 years old, a circumstance that made him acutely aware of the generational gap between them. What makes Grant's case particularly complex is how his pursuit of youth extended beyond his romantic relationships to his desperate attempts to remain youthful himself. His daughter Jennifer later wrote about her father's sometimes bizarre anti-aging regimens. "My father was obsessed with remaining youthful. He followed extreme diets, exercised compulsively, and even experimented with LSD therapy, all in service of maintaining the youthful vitality that had made him a star. His relationships with much younger women women were part of this same pattern, surrounding himself with youth as if it might somehow be contagious. Grant's final marriage in 1981, at age 77, was to Barbara Harris, a hotel public relations agent who was 47, making her 30 years his junior and 15 years younger than his daughter Jennifer, who was then 15. This created the unusual dynamic of Jennifer having a stepmother who was closer to her own age than to her father's, a situation she described as fundamentally disorienting. In her memoir, Good Stuff, Jennifer Grant described the complex emotions this situation evoked. There's something profoundly strange about watching your elderly father with a wife who is closer to your age cohort than to his. It disrupts your understanding of normal family structures and creates questions about appropriate boundaries that are almost impossible to resolve satisfactorily. What's particularly significant about Grant's relationship with his much younger final wife is that despite its potentially questionable beginnings, it appeared to bring him genuine happiness in his final years. Barbara Harris remained devoted to Grant until his death in 1986, suggesting a connection that transcended their age difference. Jennifer Grant eventually developed a close relationship with her stepmother, who she later described as a link to my father that I've come to treasure. Film historian David Thompson suggests that Grant's preference for significantly younger partners stemmed from his profound discomfort with his own origins. Archibald Leach, Grant's birth name, came from poverty in Bristol and essentially invented Cary Grant as a sophisticated fiction. He lived in constant fear that people would see through this construction to the insecure working-class English boy beneath. Very young women who had grown up with Cary Grant as an established cultural icon were less likely to question this carefully constructed persona than women of his own generation. 9. William Powell, the sophisticated bachelor's final romance. William Powell's urbane screen presence in films like the Thin Man series created an image of sophisticated maturity that made his later romantic choices particularly surprising. After high-profile relationships with actresses Carole Lombard and Jean Harlow, Powell's final marriage revealed a man drawn to companionship that crossed not just age gaps, but generational boundaries. Powell's most controversial relationship began in 1940 when, at age 47, he married 21-year-old actress Diana Lewis, creating a 26-year age gap that generated considerable Hollywood gossip. What made this relationship particularly complex was its timing relative to Powell's relationship with his son, William David Powell, born in 1925 from his marriage to Eileen Wilson. When Powell married Lewis, his son was 15, just 6 years younger than his new stepmother. What makes Powell's case especially interesting is that, contrary to expectations that it would be a brief May-December romance, his marriage to Lewis lasted 44 years until his death in 1984. This longevity challenged assumptions about the necessarily exploitative nature of relationships with significant age gaps, suggesting a genuine connection that transcended their different generations. William David Powell later spoke about the unusual dynamic created by his father's marriage. It was certainly strange having a stepmother who was chronologically more my peer than my parent. Initially, I resented the situation and found it embarrassing among my friends. Over time, however, I came to appreciate that their relationship brought my father genuine happiness after the tragic loss of Jean Harlow. Diana became more like an older sister to me than a maternal figure, which ultimately created a family dynamic that worked despite its unconventionality. What's particularly significant about Powell's relationship with Lewis is how it contrasted with the series of short-term relationships many aging male stars pursued. Rather than collecting younger conquests, Powell appeared to genuinely commit to Lewis, who effectively retired from acting after their marriage to focus on their relationship. This commitment suggests something deeper than the mere pursuit of youth that characterized many Hollywood May-December romances. Film historian Scott Amon suggests that Powell's marriage to Lewis represented a deliberate choice to create a peaceful later life after the trauma of losing Jean Harlow, who died at 26 in 1937 while in 1937, a relationship with Powell. After Harlow's death, Powell seemed to want a completely different kind of relationship, something simple, stable, and removed from Hollywood's frenetic social scene. Diana Lewis, young enough to have energy but wise enough to value privacy, gave him exactly that. Their age gap was significant, but it may have been precisely what allowed them to create the quiet, drama-free existence Powell craved after years of high-profile relationships and personal tragedy. 10. Charlie Ruggles, the character actor's surprising final act. Charlie Ruggles' career as a beloved character actor spanned from silent films through television's golden age, with his gentle, slightly befuddled persona making him one of Hollywood's most reliable supporting players. This wholesome image made his late-life romantic choices particularly surprising to both colleagues and family members. Ruggles' most controversial relationship began in 1963 when, at age 76, he married 33-year-old Marion LaBarba, creating a 43-year age age gap that generated considerable private industry gossip, though it received relatively little public attention. What made this relationship particularly complex was that Ruggles' adopted son, Charles Wesley Ruggles Jr., was 38 at the time, 5 years older than his father's new wife. What makes Ruggles' case especially interesting is how it highlights the different media treatment received by character actors versus stars. While similar relationships involving leading men frequently generated tabloid coverage, Ruggles' marriage to a woman 43 years his junior received minimal press attention. This relative privacy allowed the couple to establish their relationship away from the scrutiny that might otherwise have affected its development. Charles Wesley Ruggles Jr. later spoke about his complex feelings regarding his father's marriage. Initially, I found it profoundly strange and somewhat embarrassing to have a stepmother who was younger than me. What complicated matters further was that she and I were actually compatible as people. We had more in common with each other than either of us did with my father. Over time, we developed a friendship that defied conventional categorization, neither quite siblings nor quite parent-child, but something unique to our particular circumstances. What's particularly significant about Ruggles' relationship with LaBarba is that it appeared to genuinely revitalize him late in life. Friends and colleagues noted that he seemed more energetic and engaged after his marriage, with producer Aaron Spelling recalling, "Charlie had a new lease on life with Marion. Yes, the age difference raised eyebrows, but anyone who saw them together recognized a genuine connection that transcended their different generations." Film historian Leonard Maltin suggests that Ruggles' late-life marriage reflected the particular social isolation experienced by aging character actors. Leading men often had coteries of admirers and industry connections that sustained them socially as they aged. Character actors like Ruggles, despite being beloved by audiences, often experienced increasing isolation as their peers died and work opportunities diminished. Marion gave Charlie companionship at a time when loneliness is particularly acute for many aging performers. The marriage lasted until Ruggles' death in 1978 at age 92, suggesting a bond that transcended their unusual beginning. LaBarba, who became 48 when widowed, never remarried, a fact that challenges assumptions about her potential motivations for marrying someone so much older. This 15-year partnership, while beginning with a dynamic that many might question, appears to have brought genuine happiness to both parties despite crossing conventional age boundaries. 11. John Barrymore, the great profile's final scandal. John Barrymore's legendary status as one of America's greatest actors was matched by his equally legendary personal excesses. As his once remarkable career declined due to alcoholism, his romantic choices became increasingly controversial, culminating in a relationship that shocked even Hollywood's relatively permissive social circles. Barrymore's most controversial relationship began in 1940 when, at age 58 and in rapidly declining health due to decades of alcohol abuse, he became involved with 19-year-old nightclub singer Elaine Barry, born Elaine Jacobs. What made this relationship particularly problematic was that Barrymore's daughter Diana was 19 at the time, exactly the same age as her father's new love interest. His son John Drew Barrymore was 14, creating the unusual dynamic of having his father's girlfriend be only 5 years older than himself. What makes Barrymore's case especially complex is how his deteriorating mental and physical condition affected perceptions of the relationship. As his friend and colleague Gene Fowler later wrote, by 1940, Jack was no longer fully himself. The brilliant mind that had given us the definitive Hamlet was now clouded by years of self-destruction. In this diminished state, his relationship with someone so young raised questions about exploitation, though the complexity lay in determining who was exploiting whom. Diana Barrymore later wrote about her feelings regarding her father's relationship with a woman her own age. There is no adequate way to describe the revulsion of seeing your father, aging, ill, and declining into incoherence, romantically involved with someone who could literally have been your classmate. It destroyed what remaining respect I had for him and contributed significantly to my own subsequent struggles with substance abuse. What's particularly significant about Barrymore's relationship with Barry is how it reflected the extraordinary power imbalance created by celebrity, even for stars in decline. Despite his deteriorating condition, Barrymore's legendary status gave him access to young women who might otherwise have been unavailable to a man in his condition. This dynamic, where fame functions as a form of currency that can overcome normal social boundaries, reveals one of Hollywood's most troubling aspects. Film historian David Niven, who knew Barrymore personally, suggested that his pursuit of extremely young women in his final years represented a desperate attempt to reclaim his youth. Jack was acutely aware of his decline. The face that had been the great profile was bloated, the body that had been so athletic was failing, and the mind that had been so sharp was increasingly confused. Surrounding himself with youth was his last futile attempt to deny the inevitable end that he knew was approaching. Barrymore's relationship with Barry effectively effectively ended with his death in 1942, just 2 years after it began. This brief, controversial final chapter of his life overshadowed what had been one of the most brilliant acting careers in American history, a tragic coda to a life of extraordinary talent and equally extraordinary self-destruction. Now here's what most people don't understand about these boundary-crossing Hollywood relationships. They reveal as much about the psychological impact of fame as they do about individual preferences or character. The extraordinary environment of Golden Age Hollywood created conditions unlike those experienced by almost anyone else in society. Conditions that fostered unusual relationship patterns that defy simple moral judgments. Many of these stars had experienced a form of arrested development due to early fame, with their emotional maturation effectively halting at the age when they first achieved success. This created adults with the emotional needs and perspectives of much younger people, individuals who related more naturally to chronological peers of their emotional age than to age-appropriate partners who expected mature relationship dynamics they weren't equipped to provide. Even more significantly, the insular nature of studio-era Hollywood created a profound disconnect from normal social development. Stars who had spent decades being catered to, protected from consequences, and surrounded by yes-men often lacked the basic relationship skills that develop through normal social interaction. Their pursuit of much younger partners frequently represented not just physical attraction, but a search for relationships with lower emotional demands, partners who wouldn't expect the psychological intimacy and emotional maturity they hadn't developed. Understanding this context doesn't excuse potentially exploitative relationships, but it does provide important perspective on why these patterns emerged so consistently among Golden Age stars. Their controversial relationships weren't simply personal failings, but symptoms of an industry that distorted normal human development in service of creating marketable personas, often at devastating personal cost to both the stars themselves and those who loved them. We began by asking who these Golden Age stars were who pursued romantic partners younger than their own children, and what their stories reveal about the hidden psychological and emotional realities behind Hollywood's glamorous facade. What we've discovered is a group of individuals whose extraordinary circumstances created relationship patterns that defied normal social boundaries, for better and worse. From Charlie Chaplin's marriage to Una O'Neill, to John Barrymore's relationship with a woman the same age as his daughter, these pairings crossed not just age gaps, but generational boundaries, creating complex family dynamics that sometimes never resolve. Yet within these controversial beginnings, we also found surprising longevity and apparent genuine connection in several cases, suggesting relationships more complex than simple exploitation. What makes these stories particularly significant is how they reveal the psychological impact of fame and the studio system on personal development. Many of these stars, having achieved extraordinary success at young ages and lived for decades in artificial environments where normal rules didn't apply, developed relationship patterns that reflected their unusual life experiences. Their pursuit of much younger partners often represented not just physical attraction, but a search for emotional compatibility that their arrested development made difficult with age-appropriate companions. These boundary-crossing relationships also reveal the profound double standards that existed both within Hollywood and in broader society. The same behavior that might have destroyed an actress's career was often tolerated or even celebrated when the older partner was male, reflecting gendered expectations about appropriate behavior that persist in modified forms today. The power of studios to control narratives meant that potentially troubling relationships could be reframed as romantic rather than problematic through careful publicity management. Perhaps most poignantly, these stories highlight the complicated position of children who suddenly found themselves with parents' partners younger than themselves, creating family dynamics with no established social scripts or expectations. Their experiences remind us that controversial relationships affect not just the participants, but ripple outward, sometimes creating intergenerational tensions that never fully resolve. As we reflect on these complex Golden Age relationships, perhaps their greatest value lies in demonstrating how extraordinary circumstances create extraordinary behaviors, both positive and negative. The unusual environment of fame and fortune fostered relationship patterns that defied normal boundaries, revealing both the remarkable adaptability of human connection and its vulnerability to distortion under extreme conditions. If you appreciated this exploration of Hollywood's hidden history, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content examining the fascinating and sometimes troubling truth behind classic cinema. Leave a comment sharing which of these stories most surprised you, or suggesting other aspects of Golden Age Hollywood you'd like us to explore. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next journey beyond the glittering facade of Hollywood's Golden Age.